Hello and welcome to Show Studio. We are here today with our third panel on menswear season Spring-Summer 2017, and we're going to discuss Grace Wales-Bonaire. And I have an amazing set of panelists with me here today, and I'll just let them to introduce themselves, starting from you, Ronan.
I'm Ronan, and I'm a photographer from Northeast London.
I'm Ekow Eshun. I'm the former director of the ICA. I'm a writer and cultural commentator, and I'm also the curator of a show coming up at the Photographers Gallery next month called Made You Look, Dandyism and Black Masculinity.
I'm Marta, Represa, fashion features editor for L'Express magazine in Paris.
Amazing, thank you. And I'm Anastasiia. I'm chairing this season panel on menswear, and I'm a writer based in London. So I'm very excited about this discussion because obviously Grace Wales-Bonaire is probably one of the biggest discoveries of London fashion scene of the previous 2 years. Like she's not even 30 yet. It's her 5th collection, but she's caused an overwhelming amount of discussions, polarized opinions, and also she's got already brilliant buyers such as Selfridges and Matches Fashion. So yeah, I mean, I'm really interested where this all is coming from and what's the reason of all this hype. So to me, I think one of the things about her which attracted people was the novelty, at least to the sort of usual, let's say the usual white fashion consumers, was the novelty of the look and the story she was telling. But what I'm interested in is actually, does this look have more history than we actually know? And I'm gonna ask you, Ekow, because you already mentioned your show coming up at the Photographers Gallery, which is about dandyism and black masculinity, opening this July. So could you please tell a little bit about the concept of the show and the story it's going to be telling?
Yeah, I mean, my show at the Photographers Gallery is about black masculinity through portrait photography. So there's about 10 photographers in there, photographers from Africa, from America, from the UK, some classic studio portrait photographers like Malik Sidibe and Samuel Fosso, but also some newer British and American names. And really, the concept of the show is to look at, I guess, kind of representations of black masculinity and how you get a really interesting relationship that can evolve on the street or in the studio between a photographer and their subject. Specifically because most ideas about kind of black men especially tend to come to evolve through popular culture, through images of kind of black men in these kind of quite crude stereotyped forms, kind of brutish and demonish and slightly kind of physically overbearing. And actually, when you get photographic imagery that analyses that and kind of tries to take that inside out, what you find are different representations of masculinity. So you see men as kind of performative subjects, men who dress well, men who dress with kind of looseness or campness or performativity, men who dress for provocation, men who dress for play. And those are kind of real men out in the street or sometimes in the studio. But actually what you get when you start to assemble those photos together is this real sense that masculinity is a fluid thing. Masculinity is a performed thing. Masculinity can take many forms. It can be sometimes aggressively male, sometimes female in its expression. And all of these things, anyway, sort of wrap up quite well with Grace Wales-Bonaire's work, in as much as I think she's got a really interesting idea that you can think about menswear and you can think about blackness and you can think about masculinity, but there's no easy dividing line between those concepts, those facts, but also notions of men as gendered figures, notions of men as close to women, notions of men as slightly louche, slightly camp figures. She managed to embrace all of those things, I think, in a very sophisticated, very elegant way.
Definitely. I mean, Ronan, you've done a great body of work on representation of black culture in fashion, and you had this great exhibition called The Black Body, which looked at sort of black body in fashion and different ethnically diverse types. So what kind of idea of blackness and black masculinity or femininity you tried to challenge, and how?
I think for me it's just more about black masculinity as it is, as like a raw form, as how guys represent themselves and how people perceive them. And so for me, it's mainly just about reality and how they are now. I think Grace's pieces are amazing because she manages to bring in history and manages to sort of merge that with now. But at the same time, for me, it's more about how I feel that black men are always perceived as like aggressive or like really strong, and when you get a really feminine masculine, then they're perceived as like a woman instead of still being a man. Which is why I think it's interesting some of the kinds of makeup that Grace has used in her shows, because it's what you would normally think is feminine, but at the same time, any sort of makeup you're always going to think is feminine, and so a man in makeup is automatically going to look feminine no matter what the makeup actually is. Which is why, for example, in this first look, the guy's wearing a dress, and so automatically it's going to look feminine, because that's how all of us have like grown up and learnt to see a dress as something that women wear. So kind of thinking back to my work, and what I want to do is show real people. So Wilson, who's in Grace's presentations a lot, I met, and in my exhibition he was wearing a dress, and how that kind of came about is I was just like, how do you feel about wearing a dress? I initially had him to wear some trousers, but they just didn't fit because he is really tall. And then he just, like, the way he moved in them, in dress, was just really him. And for me, that is really important, because it's about how the guy feels in the clothes and how he feels and how he thinks people are going to perceive him and how that kind of merges. What I would find really interesting is to see real, not that these models aren't real, but obviously they're models, so the way they are is going to be different because they're going to feel pretty comfortable in anything. What I'd like to see is like real boys. Actually, a lot of the boys that Grace uses are normal boys, which is interesting. Yeah, exactly. Her friends and guys she's found and stuff like that. But like, I'd love to see guys who hang around like at Walthamstow Central and see how they would react to her clothes. That's something that I would be really interested to see in that kind of masculinity that they portray because of how their friends see them and that kind of thing, and see how that fits with the clothes and if that would work.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I know she stressed a lot, particularly in the beginning, that she had this crew of friends who she was working with, and then she would also ask them while making the clothes, doing the fitting, she would ask them, what would you add, what do you think of that? So I think it's a great collaborative aspect about it. So I wanted to ask you, Marta, as a sort of fashion journalist, fashion commentator, what do you think is so special about Grace's vision?
I think it's really good that, as you said, pretty much she's brought a different kind of cultural set of values to the forefront of fashion, which is, I think, especially in France, we have connected really well with her very quickly, because in Paris, I think there's a big tradition of the African style, especially in northern Paris. If you go to Barbès and all those neighborhoods, there's been always a very big tradition of zoot suiters. It's what we call les sapeurs. So very kind of campy dresses, very flashy dresses, and they have infused all through the fashion scene, I think, in Paris for decades now, but there was never really a designer actually taking that kind of point of view really to the catwalks, although you have brands like Laurence Airline, or you have lots of little shops in Paris.
I think what you're saying is really interesting, as much as, one of the sort of secrets of masculinity in a way is that it's all made up. Men spend most of the time pretending to be men. Men spend most of the time inheriting ideas of what men should be like. So when you talk about kids hanging out in Walthamstow Central, it's kind of like they're busy trying to be like their friends, and their friends are busy trying to be like them. And actually, the interesting thing about putting some of that stuff on the catwalk is that you can see that. You start to see that actually there's no set rules to any of that. Yes, a man can wear a dress, and it doesn't mean he's any less of a man, and so on. And what that starts to get beneath the surface of is this thing that, there isn't really a set idea of what being a man should be. It's just we all spend a lot of time with an idea about the idea that it's supposed to be like this, it's supposed to be like that, and actually the world doesn't end if a man wears a dress. I mean anything beyond the fact that, actually.
I think that's why now is a really interesting time to be part of something, and this not movement, but this freedom that we have at the moment where anything kind of goes. And I think that's why so many of us are like, well, what is black masculinity, or what is this? Because anything goes and anyone can wear anything, and if we saw a guy wearing a dress in the street, we probably wouldn't even notice or would like look straight past. And that's why it's cool, like raising all these conversations, because we're like, well, what should black masculinity be like, or what should masculinity be like in general? And we're having to look back over like everything we learned for our whole lives and kind of like try and add that together to what is happening now. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing through Grace's collections, is she's like looking back in history and trying to work out, well, how now would it be perceived, and like how now would guys wear these clothes. And that's why what I was saying was I'd like to see how, obviously, I don't know if many of these guys that she uses were into fashion before, but I kind of feel like sometimes in like this fashion circle, anything goes. But outside of that circle, does it really still go? Like for us, it does. But for young boys, young black guys who are growing up today, is this really what they see, or is this just what we think they see because we're inside this like little fashion world? That's why, yeah, I think it would be super interesting to see real young black boys and see how they would feel about the clothes, because not that these guys aren't real, of course they're real, but as well, I know some of them are studying fashion, or they're still kind of grasping at this world, if you know what I mean, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, in a way, sort of, in her one or two previous collections, the key idea was basically to take this black masculinity and put it together with really sort of European-centric idea of luxury, and to get this like blend which sort of evokes imagery from 70s, 80s in Africa, but also it's like something completely created actually by this weird world of fashion we exist in, where it has a real fixed idea of what masculinity is, what luxury is. And in a way, I think why her work is works so great, because it in a way really put a mirror to this really one-dimensional sort of image of a man, which fashion really portrays. It's this, like Johnny Depp in a sort of perfume ad. It's like, this is a man, but actually it's not, in terms of like gender representation, in terms of
I think one of the things that's quite clever about her is because, as you say, she does reference a lot of history, and what you realise is that, if previous shows are referencing Malik Sidibe studio photography, or in this show she's kind of exploring some kind of histories of Ethiopia and Haile Selassie and stuff, what you realise actually is that the more you delve through different periods in history, the more you realise actually, in fact, men have, in different contexts at different times, always dressed in extraordinary ways.
Definitely.
Actually, even, your kids on the street dress in ways that can be entirely extreme, can be entirely flamboyant, can be entirely showy. They just think they're based around authenticity and nothing else. But actually, once you strip things out, and especially once you put them on the catwalk, everything looks odd, everything looks extreme.
So, I mean, it's really hard to avoid sort of this topic, but do you think this is particularly poignant moment politically and socially to talk about blackness and black masculinity at the moment?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, I mean, definitely, especially, in a fashion point of view, it's a very, I think, dual moment in which on one side you're seeing all these very diverse brands catering to a more and more diverse kind of client. You see, not just in terms of blackness, but when brands do also clothes that are especially meant for Middle East or Asian clients. And you've got some brands who are really embracing that, and at the same time, there's some brands who seem to be actually retracting more and more into an Eurocentric ideal of whiteness, which, to me is completely, I can't understand why, if only in terms of marketing, where is the European white client? I just don't see it anymore.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this when, I've been curating the show at the Photographer's Gallery, and to some extent, you do a show of any sort about, about photography and about how ways black men are shown and about black dandies, and to some extent that's potentially a superficial thing. It's potentially a superficial thing at a time when you have a Black Lives Matter movement in America, when black men are being killed, have been killed, continue to be killed for no other reason than the colour of their skin, killed by the police who are supposed to be protecting them. So it's a strange charged moment, And potentially there's a superficiality to saying, okay, look, we'll do a show about style and appearance and visibility. I think the way I tend to look at that is that all of these things, personal style, have a politics to them. That actually there's something innately important, I think, in how, as a black man, you can take control of the ways you're seen in public. And the axes points of that, I think, are about visibility crossed with vulnerability. In as much as there's a specific way one can put oneself at risk if you make yourself more visible in the street, if you make yourself more flamboyant in the street, you become potentially more of a target. And so there's a sort of risk and a danger to that. On the other side of that, that's also a way you become more alive. It's also a way that you assert yourself and you assert your personal way of seeing the world. It's also a way that you assert how you want to be seen by the world. So style becomes something very important. Style becomes a statement that says, I am me on my own terms, and I won't be defined by the way that a world around me, a white world, wants to look at me and wants to label me. So those things become really important, and I think it becomes more important exactly at a time when black people potentially at risk. So even in Britain, there's a kind of disproportionate levels of incarceration rates, of stop and search rates for black men in Britain than any other actual sector of the population. All the more important, therefore, that people do dress on their own terms. All the more important that people do assert themselves through style, because that way lies a personal freedom. That way lies a personal radicalism.
Well, I think as well there's like this whole thing now and of like mid last year and stuff of cultural appropriation, and like people just can't stop talking about cultural appropriation, and there become these like groups on Facebook and stuff. Like I was in this group, Black and Brown Hotties. I don't know if any of you know it, but it's basically for like people of colour, like white people have no colour or something, to discuss things. And I get it from a point of where, like you were saying, it's about independence and taking back charge of where you might once have been discriminated against. But at the same time, I think it's also like you don't get any progress from segregation, and like you were saying, how some designers are now kind of pulling away from diversity and getting more like segregated. I think groups like these can be equally as destructive as they can be positive, and this cultural appropriation thing I think has been taken so out of proportion. Whereas now I get it if you are Miley Cyrus and you're wearing cane rows, and then like I don't know, like some shitty magazine is like, oh, she just invented K-Rose or something like that. I get that, but I see no problem in this world that this London where we are now being so diverse. Obviously, we're all going to take things from each other's cultures, not even take, just appreciate. And so if I wear a bindi and I appreciate which culture it's from, I don't think that's a problem. But I think it becomes sometimes in these groups really negative, and people just start to get angry about nothing, and it goes around in a cycle, and then it starts to cause problems. And so, like linking it back to Grace's shows, it's like I think the first show there was only black people. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was only black people, and then slowly now it's becoming more diverse, or only like people of colour. The last show there was one white guy, and now there's a few more people of different races and colours, which I think makes it more inclusive. And it's interesting that now she's deciding to do that. I think maybe she's made a point at the beginning and is saying this is something for us, but for others to appreciate. And now it's opening that other people can appreciate it as well, which I think is really great. And maybe other designers would be nervous to do that because they don't want to lose their message, or they also want to open themselves to like buyers and things like that. You don't want to section yourself off. And I think it's brave that she's done that, and I admire the way that she's mixed in the casting, and I think the casting is great, and I think it's always been great. Also, the Man show this season I thought had an amazing casting, was really diverse, was really interesting faces, and just thought that was something really nice to represent the world we live in. It's not all black people, it's not all white people, everyone is important. Obviously it's great to talk about black issues and other issues from other cultures, but at the same time we should all just appreciate each other's cultures.
Yeah, I just came back from the Margaret Howell show as well, which had a beautifully diverse casting. Really, really cool. And it's interesting what you were saying about cultural appropriation, because I think the line is very thin between appreciating or celebrating or actually appropriating. But I think with most of us, especially the millennial generation, many people have grown up in a very diverse kind of world with, very different cultural references. So I think, most of the things that can be called up as cultural appropriation sometimes are not. It's just
totally.
We've grown up seeing that, so why not, I don't think they even think about it.
Yeah. I think as well, I'm sure people can be really protective of their culture or something that belongs to them, and so when somebody else is doing it, they're like, why are you doing it? That's mine, and aren't as open to sharing. Yeah. I mean, it seems like a really basic idea of sharing, but sometimes I think it just comes down to
cultural appropriation is an incredibly charged topic where you can be wrong on any side of the argument pretty much pretty easily. But I think it's a great point about what you mentioned about that she moved from all black cast to a more diverse one, because I know a few people in fashion, they really did have a problem with all black cast, because what the reaction they came up with was that one ethnicity is bad, whichever it is, all black, all white is both bad. But I mean, her response to that was, if you can have all white show, why can't I have all black show? Yeah. Or if you look at, let's say, Gosha Rubchinsky, who cast only Russian boys of a certain type, it's why nobody told him, what are you doing? You cast only Russian people.
Well, as well, something I think is I didn't really think of it until I was having a conversation with someone and we discussed it. I love Grace. If you're listening, watching this, I think you're great. But at the same time, some shoots that Grace has done will be with a white photographer, a white stylist, white production team. I don't know if you have a whole team, but I know the photographer and the stylist is white. And I think that is quite interesting, where it's dealing with a really Afrocentric topic, and a lot of African guys or black guys, or even just guys of color, if you want to use that phrase. To have portraying them someone who's maybe white and middle-aged and not really now or current, and I thought that was something that, I know I love Grace, but I was thinking, they're kind of bringing Africa to the forefront of fashion, which is amazing, but maybe for me it would be really amazing if a young or an African photographer or stylist was also included. I don't know if you know, not that I think it's bad that white people are involved, of course I don't, but I would like to see how different it potentially would have been if it was a black or an African person styling and shooting, and if that would have changed the overall show or feel or shoot or whatever.
Yeah, but it's a question of gaze. I mean, just as let's say the new reinvented Playboy was, the cover was still shot by white male photographer, the same photographer who always shot it, instead of having a woman shooting other women.
So you're saying there's a dichotomy or potentially a kind of flaw in the
potentially
work.
Well, yeah, I don't want to say flaw, but something that I definitely found not surprising, but when I first realised that, I was like, wait, this is all about black people, but people that are doing it aren't black. And not that that's bad, it's just I was like...
Or at least there's less quote-unquote legitimacy to the whole project then, if you don't have a black creative gaze informing the project from start to finish. I mean, not exclusively, but certainly as a through line.
Kind of, yeah. I don't want to say it's a flaw or a bad thing. It's just, for me, it's interesting how it could have been different if it was a black person.
I feel like it has to do. Sorry, do you want to?
Sorry, no. Yeah, I was just thinking, of course, when you're working, especially in a creative job, you're inevitably bringing your background into it. So that's actually really interesting, because I actually wonder what would have come out of it. It's
a really interesting point. I guess. The question is, what's she trying to do? Is she trying to assert, and I know you've been quite clear, you're not kind of critiquing the work, but, is she trying to assert an exclusively, if you want, kind of Africanist position or not? I mean, I think one of the things that's interesting about her is that she seems to have embraced hybridity from the very start. We can see that in terms of the catwalk shows. Potentially, therefore, that goes kind of behind the camera as well. But what I like about the work is that there is no kind of singularity of gaze or perspective or ultimately, in fact, ethnicity involved in the thing. You know, the thing has always been about this very mixed up world, a world as a consequence where, you know, identities are either battling or in harmony, but certainly even if there's a sort of kind of overt blackness to the stuff, that doesn't mean that's the universal position of the work. And I think having that kind of constant balancing or unbalancing going on, I think is quite interesting. I think it sort of lends the work a sort of further tension. I think the fact that you can quite legitimately ask questions about that, I feel actually is another way of opening up that creative territory. Like, you know, all this stuff about, well, should she have kind of white people on the catwalk and so, yeah, as you're saying, you only ask that question if you're uncomfortable with a show that's got lots of black people in it, you know, and but conversely, that doesn't mean that her entire perspective is just about that, you know, that single vision.
Well, there's something actually as well that I was having this conversation with somebody and they brought up was when I first saw the ID shoot with Harley Ware and Grace, which I thought when I first saw it, I was like, this is sick, like this is amazing. I love Harley's work and I thought it was incredible. Although, on like if I'm being like really analytical, and I was looking at it and I was thinking, this is exactly what I think of. What I, you know, thought of black men was like a strength thing. They're really strong, they're really powerful, which is amazing because it's sort of like they're wearing these clothes which are very elegant and like beautifully made and everything, but still they're very, very strong, and it's all about like their skin, and they're so black and they're muscly, and that's like everything that I thought of that you might think of black men. Obviously some of the pictures aren't like that, but the ones that are like that are really strong in that way, which is incredible work. But at the same time, it's not really challenging anyone's perceptions of black men, because that's it. They're strong, they're powerful, they're like aggressive, and they're like raw, and some of the images are like this are really graphic, which is incredibly done, and I love it. But at the same time, I would like to see something that's not just like black men being super muscly and super like you know?
There's certainly more subtlety to Grace's work, like which you see on the catwalk. But somehow, when it translates into editorial, it tends to kind of move towards that
it almost feels like you were saying at the beginning about it being a novelty at the beginning. It almost feels like that, where it's like we've gone to, I think it was in Senegal, this shoot, and we've gone to Senegal and we found these guys, and they are all beautiful, but they are men in the rawest idea of men.
There's a touch of the Leni Riefenstahls going on, isn't there, in that respect?
Yeah. And it's like these are just incredible, but still it's like man, and I think it doesn't necessarily connect with the catwalk, like you were just saying, because in the catwalk it's very like serene and like very elegant, and we're walking and we're
this was a show with these are, I think those are Ghanaian wrestlers. So there is a sort of innate physicality to them. But yeah, you're right. I mean, nevertheless, there's a choice about the sort of photography you're choosing to make and the subject you're choosing to make at that moment. Yeah.
And as well, I kind of always think back, like I wonder how did they find these guys? Did they just like find a club or like guys who do like fight or something and then go there? When they left, did they leave anything? Did the guys get anything from it? Was there like an exchange, or was it just like, we'll go there, we'll shoot these guys, we're out of there, and what's left of the place afterwards? Like was it the Chanel show that was in Cuba?
Yes.
That, where I was like, what is this? Like,
that's
I don't know. I kind of obviously that's much more extreme than this, but I feel like it's kind of along the same line. You know what I mean?
In a way, they just released new work at Dazed actually a couple of days ago, Harley Ware and Grace. They did this video and a fashion shoot in India, where they sort of, toyed with the idea of the perception of masculinity in India, and they shot all these guys in the clothes, which looked incredible.
Of course.
And it's great to see something different again, and to see that it kind of worked not just on, not basically at the point where she started, but somewhere else. But again, this was the same question actually, because like, how do you work in a sort of
like I loved that day shoot as well.
Yeah.
I thought it looked visually it was incredible, but like is the next one just going to be like another place and other guys or that are beautiful, or like is there going to be something more to it? Or is it just
basically there is a sort of, sometimes it's probably better to go in depth rather than go just like
exactly,
because
like,
I mean it's inevitable, you just scratch the surface anywhere
yeah,
you
yeah,
go.
yeah. Like I'd love
I
to know more. I'd love to know more about the guys and who are they and what do they think of the clothes. And I think because Grace's collections, like we were saying earlier, it raises so many questions. I want to know about them, and I mean I want to see beautiful pictures of them in the clothes, obviously, because like I do photography, so I'm into visuals. But at the same time, in all my work, it's really important who the person is. That's why I mentioned Wilson earlier, who Grace also works with, is because he's like a beautiful soul and spirit, and you feel that when you see him and when you talk to him. And I want to know who these guys are and how they found them and what happened afterwards. Like, what happened when they did the shoot? Did they go there? Did they put the clothes on and then, like, it's that kind of disparity of like, you know what I mean.
To me, it's sorry.
Go on.
To me, that is the frontier between cultural appropriation and celebration. The celebration, it's an exchange. Mm-hmm. It's an understanding of the other as well. If you just take aesthetically what you want to take in a selfish kind of way, then it's appropriation. And that's... Yeah. I had a really big problem with the Cuba Chanel show, I would say, because I saw it as completely appropriative. Yeah. And to me, what is really interesting about Grace is that some of her clothes are really, really, there's a delicacy to them. Like sometimes you can see, it's almost like a black man in a Chanel suit sometimes. So there's the pearls, the embroideries, everything. I find that so much more intriguing than just... as you were saying, the portrayal of the black man as physically overbearing, as very strong, as very, almost aggressive. So to me, I want to go beyond that. I want to see something different, something more challenging and more mysterious. Almost.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, the truth is, imagery, this kind of imagery that we're talking about works best when it's able to embrace, I guess, a set of contradictory positions, when it doesn't seem like it's about a kind of external gaze on the black body, when it seems to have either affinity and empathy or a kind of personal insight into that physicality, when you go beyond the surface, when you go beyond the skin, when you go beyond the complexion, into a sense of what emotionally those figures are like. And that's it's an interesting distinction between that you've been pointing out between the catwalk images, or the catwalk shows, which seem to do that, which seem to find a way to express some sort of inner desire, inner flexibility, inner fragility, inner vulnerability in a show, and some of those some of those shows, some of those.
Have you seen
fashion shows
the photographer Kristen Lee Moorman's work? She's South African. So there's a photographer who's South African, and she's like amazing. I love her work. So she lives in South Africa, which is obviously very culturally diverse. There's a lot of like black Africans and white Africans, and I always feel through her work that like she knows the people, and there's that kind of comfortability that you can see through the photos, where no matter what she dresses them up in, they still look like themselves, and they still just her shots, you know what I mean? Her shots are really like friendly in that way, where it looks like she's taking pictures of her friends, and even though they might be wearing what they're not normally wearing, you can kind of they just feel so comfortable, and I would love to see that in a Grace shoot.
I know that. I mean, so Christine Lee is in the show that I'm doing at the Photographers Gallery for exactly those reasons. Yeah. Because I think she's found a way to explore sensuality, explore, if you want, strength, explore surprise, explore openness, explore kind of possibilities of gender and play and performance in these really striking images.
I think it's because she's in the setting, so she's living with these people who she shoots, and these models, and she's with them all the time, and you feel that sense of, I live here and this is my area. Like, for example, comparing it to my work, a lot of my stuff all my stuff is shot in London and shot in Walthamstow, where I live a lot of the time. So I hope that when you look at my work, you can see like I'm in London where I live, and that's why kind of it works because I know the people I'm shooting, or I've chatted to them and it's in my environment, and I think that's why it works so well for her, because she shoots in South Africa or in other parts of Africa where she feels at home, and that comes across. And that's why I think I feel this like disparity with the Grace's shoots that she's done in other countries, because it doesn't feel like I'm here and these are people that I know, whether they're the same race or colour as me or the same as me or don't. We're together in this, and that's what I'd like to see.
Yeah, it would be better to sort of see more community feel rather than
rather than like outside looking in, like you said, or somebody mentioned.
Yeah, it's also I feel so much is missing in this conversation is like particularly if you have a shoot with India, or it's like the geography and geopolitics of fashion, which is like where the stuff is made, how it is made.
Mm-hmm.
What is the difference between like what people? I mean, I was surprised that nobody actually ever mentions that when they talk about Grace's work, because I think it's also important.
I mean, a lot of what you're talking about is about power relationships, really, in some respects in fashion terms, but also just in racial terms or in, kind of personal politics terms. It's like who has the right, who has the authority, who has the right to impose their kind of point of view on the world, really. And can those be kind of balanced discussions, or are they asymmetric narratives and asymmetric power balances that you end up setting up? Yeah, it is, yeah.
I think you're always going to get that though if you base a collection on something that's past or somewhere where you're not because you're not living it. So there's already like a distance between you and it. So you're always trying to. It's kind of like your idea of what it would be like, but you can't really live it.
I mean,
that makes sense.
I think that's a good point. I think I'd resist part of that because I think, and I don't think you're necessarily saying otherwise, but I think it's actually legitimate to be illegitimate sometimes. I think it's important not to get too hung up on, well, I live here, therefore I can only express here. Actually, I think one of the interesting things about Grace's work is that because she has, referenced East Africa or referenced West Africa and Lagos and Fellow or, various other kind of parts of the world, I think I don't see an attempt to create an authentic version of those things. I see an attempt to create a hybridized, kind of personalized version of some of those histories.
Artistic narrative.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that artistic narrativizing, that artistic license allows you, to do what you want and to take the risks of that sometimes,
I completely agree with what you said. And from what I said, I think I just mean it's obviously going to feel different. And you're going to see it and you're going to create those conversations like we were all saying before anyway.
Great. So shall we actually look at the show? After all that exciting, very deep discussion. So kind of like we looked a little bit at it before and it looks quite different to what we've seen in the previous seasons.
Yes, the first few looks are much more minimal. It feels like much less embellished. Lots of work on like the structure and the architecture.
Yeah, it certainly feels sort of more structured in terms of. I mean, it's obviously different to classic menswear, but there is something really that's sort of more stiff-edged.
You can really see the religious references as well, and like the little capes and the purity of it all.
I mean, she talks about just looking at, she talks about. Referencing the Emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, East Africa. The collection presents characters of Pan-Africa. She says the influence of Selassie's ceremonial attire permeates classical dress. And there's a sort of, in fact, that left-hand image with the white double-breasted suit, you can see there, you can see Haile Selassie in the 1970s there to some extent. And, sort of Haile Selassie's a fascinating figure in as much as it's a very dandyish figure. I mean, dictators tend to the dandyish in some respects. It's kind of interface of decadence to some extent. But, you can see that sort of playing out somewhat. So the stuff is formal, but at the same time, it's it's quite playful, and there's a sort of Regency edge that creeps through a certain amount of it. This kind of formal, brocaded, embroidered element to it all, and you can almost even see that with the setting. I'm not quite sure where it was shot, but there's a sort of chandelier in the background.
Yes. What do you think, Ronan?
I think it definitely feels more playful, which I like because it's different to what it was before. But you can still see kind of the similar themes running through, which I think is really great to do, and really, really well done. Yeah, I mean, I love her work. I think she's incredible. And I love the casting. I think it's really awesome.
Yeah, the casting is really diverse in many senses, actually, not in terms of race, but also the types, and they've got quite a few, got at least a couple of women, like a few women. It's actually quite a lot for a menswear show, because you tend to have like one or two, but here she has like quite a lot of.
But I think she's selling a lot to women because her clothes are kind of small in the proportions, and they are so fluid that they adapt so well. I see constantly stuff from her that I would want to buy, so it makes sense that she puts women in the show.
I kind of wonder if your stuff adapts that well to different body types when it comes to men, because it is. I mean, it's just because it's you've got the whole plus size movement in women's wear, but you also got it in menswear, and men come out and say, look, this never fitted my body, it never will, because it's really medium size. This is like kind of women's wear medium size, not really like for everyone. So yeah, that's kind of interesting.
And there is a lot of debate on the plus size in menswear lately.
Yeah, because it's a part of discussion which always gets sort of repeated.
It's like the last thing you discuss.
Yeah. It's like, just lose some weight, man. Because with women, it has sort of this whole flair of censoring the body and stuff. When it comes to men, it's just usually like.
Because I think for women, there's the problem is more of a look from the outside world into you, whereas for men, it's more like it comes from within.
Yeah.
I think with women, the problem is always like, oh, boys are going to say you're fat, or.
Well, the thing is, men find it hard to talk about these things. For all the reasons that you're talking about, men are really bad on vulnerability, on threats to their perceived masculinity. But actually, in many ways, men are dying inside. They're really because they don't have the common language to talk about. I'm fat and I don't feel good about that. I'm too short and I don't feel too good about that. I'm losing my hair and worry a lot about losing my hair. Any number of these things. But as a consequence, actually, one of the things that happens anyway is that catwalk stuff is entirely divorced. For most of their lives, in one way or another. I mean, and the questions you were asking much earlier about, well, how would any of her work translate to, real people on the streets? It's
or even it would be a really different show if the guys from the ID shoot were in this, because they were all massive. Well, not all of them, but most of them were huge. And so it would be a completely different show if they were in this, because you wouldn't maybe you would, but it wouldn't necessarily feel as elegant and small and regal, because the clothes would need to be different, because if the guys wore these samples, it would be popping, everything would be popping out everywhere. And then that would create a completely different vibe. So that would be really interesting to see, because or even just one guy would be. I mean, it would be kind of funny, but it would be like, okay, there's one guy in here who is massive and muscly, and he's still pulling off whatever outfit he was in.
Yeah.
I mean, all you can say is this is the raw, uncut version of her aesthetic and her idea. This is like the idealised version of how the clothes could be / should be worn. You're right. After that, the real world comes into play. And just looking, what do we think about? Kind of interested in a number of sort of men in skirts, men in dresses. Again, these sort of fluidities that are going on. So this central image here. Actually, is that like a sort of over skirt to trousers?
It looks like it, yeah.
And I think what I like about that and the image, in fact, all those images is, it's this attempt to actually, we talk about that against or in relation to real life, but what I like is she's got such a strong aesthetic with these things, and the aesthetic is partly to do with the physicality of the figures involved, but also this attempt to create a sort of a different silhouette for men.
Yeah.
Because again, one of the things about menswear is it's cripplingly boring.
Yeah.
So much of the time,
Trousers,
Yeah,
jackets,
exactly. I used to go
yeah.
I used to go to all the menswear shows. When I was editor of Arena magazine, and you sit in the front row. And, 12 shows a day. 3 different cities, all the same. And so actually, there is something very powerfully liberating about this idea that you can not just show a minor variation between, quality of cloth and, cashmere versus whatever. But you can do something more dramatic and more...
There are two things that really kind of stand out. It was the other looks, I think the 7th, which is one we were just talking about, with the kind of like skirt, the 6th one, sorry, with the skirt. That one is really interesting to me because I was in Ghana a few years ago, and that looks exactly like the girls' school uniform. Like it is, it's really, really similar, and really interesting the way that it's portrayed in this show, because that is really similar to what the girls would wear to school. I'm not really sure what point I want to make with that, but it's just a similarity that I wanted to mention. And in the 7th look with the jacket, what's really interesting to me about this is the jacket and the tightness of the trousers and where they kind of pull kind of looks like a straight jacket, so he can't really move that much in that outfit. And that's kind of something interesting about men's fashion, because a lot of it is really like comfortable and like they can swing their arms and they can walk like stride, but in this you can't really. And that brings back to like the vulnerability side of it, where they're wearing this outfit but you can't really move freely. And maybe that's something linking back to Grace's ideologies and how she perceives men and what she's trying to do with it. It's quite subtle, but if he was to, I don't know, like have to run somewhere, he wouldn't be able to in that coat, and that's kind of not freeing,
Well, I mean, that says a great deal again about men's position in the world and so on. That sort of reminded me a bit. There was a sort of interesting revolution in African men's tailoring in the sort of post-independence years, in the late 60s into 70s, when sort of historically African men, serious men of business or diplomacy, they wore a Western suit. And in the 60s and 70s, you sort of move away from that. You sort of move away from a shirt and tie to what they used to call a political suit, which is, basically a sort of a twin set, the twin set kind of cotton thin without lapels, which you didn't need to wear with a jacket, with a shirt and tie. It's a sort of different, more casual, more African look. And it's very tied up to do with independence politics, because this is the idea of you could have a sartorial aesthetic that was authentically African, that didn't rely on Western constraint, that was designed with an African climate in mind. And so the prints for that could be more bold and so on. So lots of African politicians used to wear the political suit, Kenneth Kaunda and Lumumba and all of these people, actually Lumumba slightly later, but anyway, they used to wear these kind of clothes. And in a way, what I like there is a sort of reference to a period before the advent of the political suit, when actually you get these figures in that image, in that suit of Grace's, who were still struggling with some of those personal dynamics you're talking about constraint, but also actually there's a kind of reference to a kind of pre-independence era in Africa, when African men wanted to be taken seriously on an international stage and therefore looked to the West as a set of reference points. And Haile Selassie actually becomes an interesting inflection point, because a political leader powerfully asserting independence for Ethiopia, and also setting all sorts of actually kind of political ripples in the wider world, especially once you go to the West Indies and Haile Selassie becomes a god, to Rastafari. There's quite a lot going on in some of those, in some of the choices that she makes, in terms of some of the references she's pulling from.
Yeah. Also, one thing I wanted to mention was speaking to another friend of mine who has a brand called Super Yaya, and she lives kind of between Ivory Coast and Lebanon. And we were talking the other day, and I found it really interesting what she was saying about how a lot of places in Africa and the Caribbean as well, this whole thing of like fast fashion hasn't really happened yet. So you still need to like buy fabric, take it to a tailor, get your thing made, and you can't just like go out and buy stuff. And I think that lends really nicely to Grace's collection, because it doesn't look like you can just buy loads of them in a shop. It's kind of really thought out. You've thought out your design, you've taken it somewhere, you've made it, and it fits you perfectly. Like it wouldn't fit anyone else, which is what I think we see.
I think that's perfectly right. You know, I talked to my dad. You know, my family's from Ghana, so my dad was there, whatever, growing up there, you know, 40s, 50s, 60s. You know, you wanted to see, you just go to the tailor.
Yeah.
There's no other option.
Yeah, exactly.
And, you know, certainly in terms of women, actually, you see women, you know, in Ghana or anywhere else who are going to weddings, who are going to celebrations. They all have, you know, they all go and buy the cloth. Exactly. They all get the stuff made up. Yeah. There's no other way of dealing with that.
Yeah.
Which brings a much more, I think, rich, interesting, sartorial point of view. And,
Yeah, it's absolutely that. Well, so it means you get to play with cut, with fabric, with pattern, with colour. All of these things start to come into play much more. And more to the point, you see those much more visibly just out on the street.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, everyone's a designer in their own respect.
I think in a way it brings back this her idea of this kind of her identity and this Western idea of luxury again, because you see really sort of some of the looks, it's really like the suit, really strict. So what do you think, Marta, about the show?
I'm really liking it actually. I was thinking what you said before about that white suit being very constrictive in a way, and that is a really interesting cut. But in general, in the catwalks, sort of the floodgates have opened to for a role reversal. You see, I don't know, the Gucci shows. Basically, you can't tell who's a boy, who's a girl. They're all mixed up now. Well, we were talking before about all these menswear brands switching to the women's wear calendars. We saw earlier this morning J.W. Anderson, who pretty much likes to make everybody uncomfortable in the catwalk. Lots of boys in really long shirts that look like dresses. We've seen boys in dresses at Astrid Anderson, I think, as well. We're seeing that pretty much constantly now, and the girls on the other side are getting more and more comfortable, and you see less and less heels. You see more and more the girls are, you remember a couple of years ago when they walked like waves kind of, you know, and now they almost walk like boys, kind of thrust forward and everything. And I think that's really interesting, and the doubt that I have, is that really going to translate to the street, or is that a little fashion bubble?
I think obviously most high fashion just doesn't translate to the street because it's so expensive. So you're never going to get that because nobody can ever afford it. I mean, some people can, but like normal people can't afford it.
But more like the attitude and the idea, is that really, like, are people actually ready for that?
I think so.
I mean, in London, I guess so. London is a quite special place in terms of the way you can behave, the gender norms which exist here. They do not translate to a lot of places in the world, other places in the world, but yeah.
That's true. I think we forget that because like we're in London I'm in London most of the time, and then you leave London and everybody's like still pretty conservative, and if you're wearing something different, they look at you and stuff. So I think maybe it's London.
I mean, I think it's the job of any, you know, artist, fashion designer. Partly you're trying to set trends, but partly you're trying to be open to the things that are already going on. You know, so you know, all the debates, and we talk about cultural appropriation, but also we can talk about debates around gender identity and fluidity and so on. All these debates that are going on, that, you know, they don't start in fashion. You know, and I think what you're talking about is absolutely interesting, and as much as you know, it touches on some of the really contentious stuff that exists around this, and actually I think I feel it's an exciting and important thing. And when you see that reflected in fashion or any other creative worlds, just because it allows another lens and another way of seeing some of those issues to be kind of signposted and highlighted. Like, I mean, you know, I don't know the backstory to it at all, but you know, today there's a mass shooting in a gay club in Florida, I think it is, or America.
Yes.
You know, which is terrible, and you know, whatever the reasons for that, highlights just the fact that, you know, these things aren't settled. And I think the more fashion, as much as any other area, highlights some of the complexity of that, highlights the fact that these things aren't set in place, these things shouldn't be, or don't need to be set in place. I feel that's a healthy thing, and that's a good thing.
I mean, coming back to the world of fashion, do you think this has its consumer? Do you think this stuff has a, I don't know, just viable potential in terms of the industry? I mean, Marta, you probably would be the person to ask this.
Yeah, this makes me think. I was talking to somebody the other day about the LVMH prize and thinking who's going to win. And somebody told me, I don't think Grace is going to win because journalists like her too much. Basically, so the jury are looking for other things than just what the journalists look for, which is the story, most obvious storytelling and aesthetically pleasing aspects of it. As for the buyer, I'm not too sure. I think she does. It will be definitely a very educated consumer and mostly urban.
Because it's like, I'm just wondering, does it work if you take all the story away, which happens when you see just a jacket on the hanger? Is it really gonna work?
I don't know. I think like especially the jackets are really covetable. I think, or I don't know. I would buy them actually. So
yeah, I think she has quite like a high price point as far as I know. It kind of goes into that category. In that sense, it's also I looked at the show and was like, this looks like Paris material to me. I don't know if it does to you. It looks like something which would in a few years would end up there rather than in London.
Well, I hope she stays in London.
Well, maybe, I don't know, before we finish, each of you could say like a few words on the show or anything like that about Grace.
I really love the show. I think the show is great and I really love what she's doing. And even though I have some doubts or some things that I would like to see more of, I think overall she's great, and I love that she keeps the personality coming through with the casting, with the clothes. Like nobody in the show looks out of place and nobody in the show doesn't look comfortable, which I think is really important. So I love what she's doing, and I'd love to see it in other ways than the ways that she already does.
Yeah, I mean, I think you got to keep it complex. I think what's interesting, what's fascinating about the work is this constant set towards the hybrid. I mean, I'm interested in the way she references all these historical moments and periods and brings them into the work. I think, the interesting there again is that can raise questions about how successfully you can do that or not. But I'm just personally interested in someone whose field of reference goes through these different areas of African history or politics or Pan-Africanism even. Some of these references, stretch back a couple of hundred years. And I think it makes for a rich and surprising way of approaching fashion. I like the way you can be of a moment and of several other moments simultaneously. It's a healthy thing.
Yeah, not too much of the moment, not too much of other moments. She does have the balance, actually. Yeah, and I think in a way she's really a present to the fashion industry right now. She's arrived in the right moment, and she's bringing, I think, a story and a completely personal and different aesthetics to everything else that we've seen. And that is a really good thing in an industry that is overcrowded sometimes.
Great. Let's give her a round of applause.